Hello everyone, and welcome to a Corbinsoft webinar dealing with Pragmatic DevOps maintained in a Certified ALM Framework. My name is David Merrill. I'm the CTO and Principal Consultant at Corbinsoft and a longtime Applearian employee prior to the acquisition of Clarion by Siemens. I have many years of what I will call sort of boots on the ground experience, both planning, designing, and implementing Applearian across a wide variety of customer bases. Today, I will be your guide for the next 60 minutes. So I'd like to start with just a few, shall we say, housekeeping suggestions. This webinar will be recorded and will be made available on Corbinsoft.com. We also will be publishing it on YouTube as well. I would encourage you to use the questions panel throughout this presentation. I actually will pause from time to time and I'll read those questions, and if I can address them during the webinar itself, I'm very happy to do so. We'll also, as you see, have some time at the end for addressing those questions specifically. Also, if you have any difficulty using the GoToMeeting webinar client, please feel free to chat to the panelists. I'm joined by colleagues from Corbinsoft who will be able to respond to your questions and concerns via chat while I'm speaking. The agenda today is fairly simple. We really don't have a lot of time to cover all of this material, so I'm going to do my very best effort to scrape the surface of this challenge of DevOps. I'll talk a little bit about why I'm here and why I'm talking about this, and perhaps also touch upon why some of you may be here as well joining this webinar. And then we'll move into an active demonstration where I hope to be able to address some of these 5 DevOps challenges that were discussed in the overall webinar. So without spending too much more time talking about what we're going to do, let's talk about Applearian. As a user of Applearian for many years, I really tell the story of Applearian's success through these customers. Not just that they're logos on a page, but behind each of these sometimes very crucial customer is an excellent story of adopting Applearian, integrating Applearian into their product development cycle, whatever that might be, and using it to take advantage of some of the collaboration, saving time, saving money, but really fulfilling a revenue channel. We'll often see the case where these customers aren't just creating software, some are creating full products in a mechatronic environment. And this is typical when we see things like automotive companies or suppliers to the automotive industry, medical devices, and avionics. But there's also a rich array of customers that aren't doing any kind of non-software development. And today I'm mostly going to be focusing on true software development in Applearian. Just know that behind these concepts that I'm talking about are real full implementations of Applearian to back up these concepts that we'll be talking about. Sorry, I jumped a little bit too far ahead. There we go. So for some of you, the concept of ALM, particularly in DevOps, might be a new idea. And so I'd like to speak a little bit about how Applearian introduces application lifecycle management. You can also think about it as a software development lifecycle or software lifecycle management, SLM. And Applearian, for many years since I've been associated to it, has been a pure web-based association to these kinds of tasks, really opening up collaboration for the continuum of activities that might begin with the ideation of a product, but to transcend into requirements management and test management. But it really doesn't stop there. It continues through all of the different efforts associated with both initially bringing a product to market and keeping that product, maintaining that product in the marketplace. So we'll talk about something special in Applearian called Live Docs. We'll talk about process and workflow automation, how we can plan and execute development, and really deal with perhaps one of the most important items inside Applearian, and that is this notion of an end-to-end traceability along this life cycle of activity, so that we really can see from the highest level ideas or goals how a product is implemented into the production environment. So Applearian really seeks to connect projects and teams together. It's often the case that Applearian might begin in a silo with one group, and that group might have an issue associated with building agile scrums or requirements management. But as a product, it allows this full cycle of activity, so you can add to it and bring others to this collaboration life cycle, where the activities of coding and testing get full citizenship with the same artifacts or documents that issue the basic requirements. And we're going to focus today specifically on moving that forward into release and deployment. And so I think there's a genuine debate on whether or not ALM really does matter to DevOps. And from my perspective, I think maybe we often see that an ALM activity will stop at that line where DevOps engages. And the building, the testing, the deployment happens outside of Applearian. But a traditional view of DevOps is to really exclude what happens before the build. And so ALM really helps us answer the following questions. Are you building according to all the right requirements? Have you really executed all of the automated and the manual tests? So often cases, it's not a practical realization that every single test for software is exclusively automated. And there's a combination of these two, and often they're kept in separate silos. And the traceability is not visualized from all requirements to both automated and manual tests. And then ultimately, once we deploy into a production environment, if we're deploying to IoT devices, or if we're deploying to other embedded locations where there's a lot of customer exposure to faults and to behaviors of the software, are we able to show that our deployment is auditable against our own quality process and standards, whatever they might be? Certainly in some industries where there's SOX compliance or other obligations for specific industry standards, there might be a very keen awareness of the standards that must be followed. But most companies want to achieve a good quality process in their environment. And so ALM allows that to be part of the DevOps continuum. Now, I'd like to talk about 5 principal concepts that aren't mine necessarily. They were introduced by Forrester Research and published through Xenos. And they talk about these 5 principal areas to succeed. And I think they're very much answered in how Applearian ALM can interact with DevOps. So one is the culture. Can this tool be implemented across the entire culture? Can we engage with the type of people who will really use the tool so that activity doesn't happen outside of this continuity of solution, but within it? And can we really engage and use all the different technologies available? The software development environment with different methodologies and plugins for different tools is ever changing. The tools that we deal with today are very different than the tools that we dealt with even 5 years ago, or certainly 10 years ago. And the emphasis for automation is always in the goals of companies adopting Applearian and DevOps. So how can we move from perhaps a majority of manual tests turning the tables so that we have a majority of automated tests. And instead of waiting for an IT department to go through a lengthy manual deployment, can we engage through an approved testing cycle through automatic deployment? And one comment that I heard from a practitioner is that until we're ready to be able to deploy hundreds of times in a day, then we'll probably never be able to respond to a mobility market where we are having to deploy so frequently to the customer base across multiple platforms. However, and so sort of part of the message of ALM is to make sure that each of those deployments have full integrity. So we're deploying the right thing at the right time with the right tests. So let me talk a little bit about how a pragmatic institution of ALM and DevOps answers this question of culture. And I see this all the time as we implement solutions like Applearian with our customers, that I'm really never talking about just one department or even just two departments. In fact, if I were to sort of project my own experience on top of some of the messaging from Forrester, they talk about development and deployment as being the key cultures to software deployment and to this certified framework. And I would add into that there's invariably a project management office or marketing, which is a driver, and they have visibility. And in good practices, we'll see some level of system and requirements engineering taking place, whether that's a very formal process through requirements documentation and traceability through a work breakdown structure, or free moving through the expression of user stories and tasks and defects as the dominant way to plan and design software. But invariably, there is a domain that monitors that process. And then we have the development activity where the work is really done. And quality assurance, where the tests are performed and the multiplicity of tests are analyzed to really lead to the question, is it okay now to then be able to deploy that? So as we sort of engage, as I engage some of these very lofty concepts that are passed around through some of the technology discussions, when this hits the customer environment, we invariably need to identify these domains and make sure that the solution operates within them. And I'm going to talk more about how Applearian as a solution can then enable people, process, technology, and automation. I know that's a lot of things to put together into one concept, but it's really designed to take the kinds of tasks that might be happening in documents and in siloed work groups and bringing them all together in that overall continuum. So I will address how a Applearian document really matters to DevOps and how we can express the type of process automation that we need to have before deployment within Applearian. And then bring the release and the work management of Scrum and Agile delivery, whether it's or I should say Agile delivery, whether it's Scrum or Kanban or some hybrid model together, how that can then become as freely organized as some of the goals for those methodologies are. And ultimately tie into the need to establish end-to-end traceability, to be able to demonstrate of software that is shipping that we've isolated all of the valuable requirements and that we see those valuable requirements tracing to test cases and those test cases have executed. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about LiveDocs. It's a new concept for a lot of people. Some tools will be able to export into a document, and most tools, in fact, do. However, a Applearian LiveDoc is a very important object unto itself. So it's not a Word document that contains requirements, but rather a vibrant container that can hold all of the activity associated to the group of requirements or a backlog of user stories, or epics that are going to be part of a safe framework. All of these elements can be put together in a very serviceable container, a document that many stakeholders are used to seeing. And they can see it in Polarion and use it in quite the same way that they might a Word document. However, its objects are the backbone of the Polarion database. So I can manipulate the work items themselves within that document container and allow for commentation and so forth. So we'll see that live in just a moment. The other element that's key here is process and workflow automation. And I know that name workflow is often overused. In Polarion, it has some very specific implementations. And that is around the different types of work items or records, objects in Polarion that we'll work with. We'll see that a requirement is an example of a work item, and that requirement has a workflow that will let me combine prerequisite conditions with automated functions so that whatever the process is of the customer bringing Polarion in can be modeled within the tool. And this is so key to the long-term success of such a project in my experience. How effectively can the solution model what the customer does, not what the template or the software dictates to the customer? Workflow objects are not just limited to work items, they're also the documents themselves, the test runs themselves. So the same things that can control an individual requirement can control the overall landscape of the document itself. So let's talk a little bit about how Polarion injects into the same environment, not just the requirements, but executing. So these are some examples of how we can now organize our work, not of copy and pasted information, not of summarized information, but of the actual objects themselves that we're working with in every other location. So we can set up a Kanban board, we can set up a Scrum board, and they can be part of our daily and weekly meetings, and we can take execution and move progress through in those meetings as part of the activity. And again, we'll see that a little bit in a live format. So in the back of my mind is always the goal to obviate the need for a separate Microsoft project plan document associated with the kind of development activity of ALM. So we can integrate multiple levels of releases and iteration management within Polarion, again, built upon the very structure and outcomes of the objects that are going to be important to what we deploy. And we'll see that a little bit later. End-to-end traceability is a high-level concept that we'll see manifest in just a moment, and this is one of the key things. In fact, if you take all three of these main topics that I've just talked about, Applearian Documents and the workflow, the workflow engine and its capabilities and powers, and traceability. If we take those three concepts, those are year after year after year the dominant differentiators that our customers say are important to Polarion and make it different than just about any other tool out there. Lots of tools will talk about traceability, but they might be limited to the types of things that you can trace. They might be limited to one project. Polarion lets me quite literally trace any object across the entire repository. And it is the foundation of making sure that our workflow process is effective all the way down through the traceability structure, as well as making sure that we can just simply say, have we executed every test we were supposed to before this deployment happens? And again, we'll see that a little bit later on. Now, towards the end, time permitting, we'll see also an engagement of how DevOps then works with ALM. So we saw before that we had this build, test, and deploy, three separate activities that are part of DevOps that can be conjoined to one another. And so we will see how Polarion can interact with GitHub. So I'll check some code into GitHub and we'll see how that code links. We can launch a build and deal with Jenkins builds that we respond to the type of merges that might happen in the master branch of a Git repository, and then exchange from the certified results of build and test activity to be able to deploy with other tools. And I'll actually show some of this done within Applearian itself, but behind Applearian is a very rich API and an ecosystem of extensions that will allow us to work with other tools, other technologies that become important. All right, I'm just going to take a pause for a moment and again encourage. I don't see any questions being asked in the webinar, but I'd like to reiterate an invitation for you to put those questions in, particularly as I get to the next piece, which is some demonstration scenarios where I'll bring Applearian to the foreground, and we'll interactively go through these three scenarios. So first is, we're going to review what is being worked on, what is developed. I certainly don't have time to talk about every aspect of Applearian, but we'll touch some of the key elements. We'll look at work items and documents and traceability. We'll see how the process workflow engine can be engaged in there. We'll see how a user story can link to a change request and to requirements inside of a Scrum iteration or a sprint. And in that process, we'll make some changes to the source code and link that to those requirements into that user story. And then we'll move on to being able to build and execute some tests and see the results of those tests within the Applearian interface. So with that, I'm going to leave this PowerPoint slide alone for just a moment and bring up the Applearian web browser. And so this is probably just a good time to pause and talk a little bit about the Clarion Server. It is different than a lot of some of the other servers you might be aware of. It's a very slim form factor. It can be as simply installed as a single server, fully functioning in a very short amount of time, or it can expand to be a vibrant and rich redundant cluster within a large enterprise environment. And so it spans that continuum very well. So it will be able to grow as you grow. It's entirely a web-based application, so there's no installable client. We're going to be looking at a hosted instance. So this is something that at Corbinsoft we engage with our customers and prospects to share information on this server, and it's also, of course, what I use for demonstrations often. On the left-hand side is the context of the project. And you'll be able to see that a Clarion Server is maintained of many projects. And so I can easily have projects working together as well as individual projects working by themselves. In this navigation pane, I have a user-definable view of all of the different objects within the project. So I might go take a look at the dashboard, or I might jump right into specifications. And so that's really what I'm going to do right now, is I'm going to jump into a particular space here, and we're going to look at the specifications that might be part of our environment. And as I change elements inside here in the navigation, you'll see this workspace basically shows the dynamic content. It's also very much user definable. So I can combine user instructions for the workflow of what I should be doing. I can dictate, what kind of preparation might be here and define what I expect to see inside this area. Or I can move quickly to be able to create new documents or import them from Word or Excel or other formats. I don't have too much time to talk about that today. That might be subject for a future webinar, but it's certainly important for new users to be able to come into and download and view a Applearian document quickly from its original Word document or from other data sources where those documents might reside. This is a view of a Applearian document, and it happens to be a document for software requirements. As I mentioned before, it's a container of objects, and so I can see some dynamic information about the document itself, and I can move through and see what I'll call unstructured text, and that's the information to the reader of the document that might not necessarily be itself a requirement for implementation. And in fact, for our purposes today, earlier, I went down to the bottom of the document and created something new. So for very large documents, it's often helpful to be able to see this outline. And I'm going to move down to the bottom here to the ServiceNow interface requirement, and we'll see just one very simple requirement. This requirement is easily entered into the document, so if I happen to want to enter in another one to say, okay, the system shall return and so the system engineering, the requirements engineering stakeholders, the project management office might come in here and be able to create new and progressive requirements that are ultimately handed to the development team for execution. If I don't need a requirement, I can just get rid of it. And if I save the document, then that temporary item becomes a permanent item inside Clarion. Now, it's important to note that whenever I see this icon here in the Applearian document, that is an example of a data record. And I can move transparently between this this document view to more of a tabular view. So if I happen to sit right on top of this particular requirement that I just authored, I can now move into the table view and see a much more robust set of information about this particular requirement and the group of requirements. And inside here, I can do bulk edits and have access to a very vibrant set of attributes or custom fields that you as a user can define. So this again sort of responds to this question of domain access, because inside Applearian, I'm going to just move here on the left-hand side to the listing of the different work item types in a project. This particular project has a set of work items that simplify a requirement and deal with epics and user stories, which are part of key Agile concepts. But I can use these very basic work items to build a hybrid model between a V model of requirements and the Agile implementation or execution of those. You as a user can control what each of these work items are and how they differentiate from one another. So what makes an epic, for example, much different than a requirement? And so here you see a high-level epic with different fields and different content and its traceability linked to individual user stories. Now, you'll actually see that if I go back to the requirement that we're looking at, one key element of traceability is we'll see right here the individual trace of this requirement to a user story. And so I can just simply click on this user story, and now I'll see this item that in the next part of the demonstration I'll begin to act upon. But also what I want to do is point out that let me open this up in a new tab, that inside the Applearian document view, and I'll use this as an opportunity to sort of close out the discussion of a document and move on. Inside the Applearian document view, in addition to viewing the outline and changing the content, I have the ability to set up specific approvals. So if I want to be able to allow my stakeholders to look at individual requirements and approve or disapprove of their content, this becomes part of that people collaboration where all stakeholders can have the right level of access to interact with these and possibly to create a comment like this requirement is not yet testable. And as a stakeholder, maybe then I'll change this and I'll disapprove that. I'll save this information, and if necessary, I can turn on an electronic signature. So for validated environments, places where the integrity of who actually approved or disapproved of something is important, that can be enabled with a CFR 21 Part 11 electronic signature. I can also disable that so that my users are not necessarily encumbered by any of this activity. And so with comments and with approvals, a review of the document can take place. And this might be the review of the project management office before the final development work and readiness for approval or release is done. Additionally, the document as a whole has a set of properties. And so I can set up both custom fields and the workflow to say, for example, rework this document into a new version. Or perhaps I would mark this document as obsolete if I wasn't going to use it. So this is also user definable, so as much or as little of a process around document lifecycle as necessary can be built into Clarion. But again, we're not going to spend too much more time on this. I just wanted to make sure that you understood that this is a very important construct to all of the objects inside Clarion. And so I might have different work items contained in different documents. I might even have a document of tests. Okay, so the next section is now to take this requirement that we've authored down here at the bottom and prepare it, do work on it. And so what I'm going to do is show how in Applearian this requirement then can interface with the user story. And we saw some of this right here. Now, in doing so, I'm going to change into a planning view. So let's start off by switching to a different query, and I'm going to just show all of my unplanned user stories. And I'll sort these, or maybe I would just simply type something like ServiceNow if I was looking for a user story that had some of that text in, so I can really highlight this particular set of user stories. I have it set with story points of 5. It's been reviewed and accepted. I have a task associated to it. And then I'm also going to add a new task, which is a task to actually, as part of this, create a test case. And these become the breakdown of the user story to what I expect my teams to do during the development process. But as you can see, it's not been set into any particular sprint. I can do that quite simply by going into the planning sidebar, and I could find the particular iteration where I might want to be adding this particular one. So I'm going to allow this spike or this addition of the user story to be inserted into iteration 3. So I'll add that and save it. And then if I open up my whole plan, I'll see all of the activity of this particular iteration. So this is the planning feature of Applearian. I'm going to pull back and look at all of the plans so that we can see not just what I'm working on right now, not just the one iteration, but rather all of the iterations. Are they completed? Are they in progress? Are they planned? All the versions as well. And so my releases can be two-tiered, as we see here, with a version of software and sprint iterations, or they could be multiple major and minor releases and additional sprints as part of the organized activity. But I really do want to come in and start working on this iteration 3. So we're going to open this plan up and see that we have a lot of statistics. Now, some of this data is sort of frozen in time and is fairly static in nature, but we'll be able to have metrics and dashboarding associated to it. The plan has statuses that ultimately we'll be able to move to build and deploy from this page as well. But what I really want to do is come down and look at what I've just recently added right here. As a ServiceNow user, I want to receive better information. And so I can start to move these tasks now right into being able to move and start progress. So I need to make changes to the Applearian API plugin. So I'll start that effort. And in doing so, it's probably a good idea for me to actually bring up and show you an example of that. So I'm going to pull up my, let's see, I need to find it first. Give me just a moment here. I'm going to pull up my Eclipse interface. And so this is an example of writing custom Applearian plugins using the Applearian API in Java in Eclipse. And so I'm going to add some extra messaging information to the return of a successful ServiceNow incident has been created in Clarion project. So fairly incidental, but enough of a change that I'll be able to save this, change the file, and now I'll see how I can now interact with the ultimate source code that's going to be part of that build and deploy strategy. Okay, I have loaded this into Git, and we can see that I have multiple files here that are associated with those changes. Let me go ahead and pull up and refresh my view. I have 20 change files, and I'm now going to commit this as part of my demo-based user story. Now comes an important part. Inside this commit message, once I commit it to the master, I want to include a message. And that message is going to be linked to the actual activity that I'm working on. Now, I could certainly put in information about this user story, but in my case here, I actually want to take this particular item, right? So this work item, in fact, let me just copy the link. I'll just actually copy just this ID here. And inside this git commit message, I'll say changes associated to and I just need to provide the Applearian work item ID in this commit message. So with GitHub particularly, it's a distributed source control. So I've committed this locally to my master. And now with those changes, I want to be able to push those changes up to the GitHub repository as a whole. And so if I showed you here and we refresh this view, this is the view of my GitHub repository, and we'll be able to see, again, the changes that I just made. And I'm going to come back to Applearian now and see that these changes are actually linked up to Applearian. So if I refresh this item, give me just one moment here, I should expect to see the linked revision show up here. It's going to take just a couple of minutes for it to show, but it'll show up here in this particular item that we've created. So now I'm going to go and complete this activity. So I've made changes to the Applearian plugin. I can use this work item to make progress and to complete it. This is part of the workflow associated with this particular task, and I've done that. And as I make these changes, then when I go back and look inside the plan itself, we'll be able to see the movement of that task change within my sprint board here. And so you can see that it's moved from in progress to being done. And then I want to be able to create a test case as well. And this is an important concept inside Applearian, that whenever I create items, such as requirements here, and when I link them to user stories, I can also create the test cases directly here. So I can create a verifying test case, and we'll just say we want to be able to test the system And inside of a test, it's a different type of work item than a requirement. So I might have certain steps, and this could be, in this case, it might be a manual step. So manually and we'll see later on how we will combine the manual test cases with the automated test cases as well. So now that I've created that test case, it's linked to this particular requirement, and I'm free now to perhaps come back here and say, all right, I'm going to go ahead and allow this to be marked as done and verified. I'm going to do the same here. Yeah, I need to advance it completely. When I make the changes, I'm still required to fill out the right number of fields. So I have to follow the process no matter whether I'm doing a quick closure as part of a meeting. So I need to make sure all the mandatory fields that my process requires are completed. And that's all done here within the sprint board. So this might be now a case where I've completed all of this effort and I'm prepared now to take this user story and say, not only have I started progress here, but this user story is really ready to be marked as implemented. Implemented, but not necessarily tested and deployed. Returning back to the iteration, as this progress happens, we'll see the burn down charts being affected as I make the necessary changes throughout. Okay, so one of the questions that has come up is, how the different stakeholders can have access to this, the system and tool. And that's an important distinction to say that it's very likely in all of those domains that I mentioned that the project management office and the developers or the requirements or system engineers might not have quite the same level of access of Applearian. And that's absolutely true, that you can, at a project level or at a global level, really control the nature of who the stakeholder is, what information they can view, even what fields they can view, so that they don't see too much, but certainly have access to be able to collaborate at the right level. Now, let's go on and continue a little bit into the notion of DevOps. So I'm going to fictitiously imagine that I'm done here with this, and then we're going to now move up and look at the overarching plan. And we'll do the same thing here. I'm going to choose to build this. So I can click this button here, or I can come into properties and see the attributes of the whole plan and perform that status change right here, that we're going to launch a build. And I'll go ahead and save that. Now, when that happens inside Applearian, we have either reached out and interfaced to Jenkins or whatever the build and test tool is. In this particular project, I have it also built right into Applearian. So as we talked about at the very beginning, Applearian does have the capability to handle build management. So if I come down and look at this, I can see, sure enough, I just launched a build with my authentication, but it failed. And why did it fail? And what were the results of those failures? That's not unusual for me. To make software changes that ultimately fail when I build it. But what I'd like to be able to do is see the effects of that. And so inside this particular build, let's create another one, and I'll build it with a smaller set of artifacts here, and it'll be successful. Some examples of what the results of the build and the test process would look like feed directly into the context of a Applearian test run. So in this project, you can see also that I have builds earlier today that failed. And if I come in and look at the test runs, we see the results of these test runs of automated builds. So I haven't executed these manually, but rather through the build method. And the test run results give me how many have passed, how many have failed, and I can see at that full citizen level, if you will, the results of successful automated tests and failed automated tests as well. And so seeing the build information come back into these formal test runs help to contribute to that final question, that final step of whether or not deployment is ready. So because I did not build it and build it successfully, I probably shouldn't perform the next function here that I'm going to, but I'll do it anyway. And that is to return to this this version, the release here that I'm working on, and then we're going to actually deploy it. So this is going to deploy to my test server, and again, in this case, I'm engaging directly with the Applearian deployment method, but it could also engage with one of those other tools, Deploy Hub, Bamboo, Electric Cloud, or a homegrown deployment method to a test environment or to a production environment. Now, once I perform that, you can see it changes the nature of this plan. This plan is completed. And so now this becomes a record that I can maintain for audit history and availability. Now, none of this would quite be reasonable to stop on it if not for the report that I'm going to show you now. And behind the scenes, one key element inside Applearian is to be able to set up traceability. So here's a case of looking at all of the requirements and the test cases. And I can view some of the information and content about that traceability, whether or not defects or issues have been created as part of that. You know, we'll see some of them down below that were based on some of the failed tests. This traceability table can be exported into Excel or to PDF and is an important artifact as part of the development process. But the next report is perhaps even keener, and that is being able to specify not just the requirement and the test case, but whether or not a test has been executed. And so you can see here, just by my number of missing cells here, I'm nowhere ready to deploy this application into a production environment. Requirements aren't answered with mapped test cases, and but down below you can see the ones that I have. I can click on this hyperlink and be able to open that test case in question and possibly make that part of a test run. But right now, this particular test record, test case, while it exists, has never been executed. And that becomes an important aspect to really what I would call the contribution to the build and the deploy ready test. So once this is filled with all past requirements, then I will be ready to deploy that into production. All right, in the interest of time, I'm going to step away from this live presentation, come back to the slides for just a minute to wrap up. And I want to thank you for participating. We'll do a soft close of the webinar now, but I will stay open online for the next few minutes if you want to contribute with any questions or chat on the GoToMeeting webinar panel. I want to, again, thank you for attending. You are also free to contact me individually or Corbinsoft as an organization. We are available to give you a more directed demonstration or talk to you a little bit about your needs of bringing ALM into a DevOps environment. And we can offer you extended and guided evaluations. So instead of watching me scrape the surface here in a brief webinar, you can try it yourself and see how this might engage in your own product development cycle and DevOps environment. Again, thank you very much for attending, and I'll look to see if any questions or chat items come through. Thank you very much. I'll stop the recording now. Okay, one question that's come in is the availability of integrations. And that's actually an interesting concept. You know, I talked a little bit about a Jenkins integration. There's a Jenkins integration available on the Clarion extensions page. And then there's also, I believe, some very active development going into a product-centric integration. But invariably, what I encounter in the field, so to speak, or with customer implementations, is there's not just one build method, but there's several. And there's not just one end-to-end free-flowing deployment, but there's deployments with key benchmarks and workflows and approvals that have to be answered. And with that, the true answer to this question is not just does an extension exist or an integration or a plugin exists for a particular product, but what tools are available inside Applearian to respond to that. So I'm going to take just a moment, change this URL, and we're going to open up a documented page for the Applearian API or the SDK. And this is really what was part of my work to be able to, build that plugin that I showed you earlier. And it is the way that we respond to very specialized requests from customers, not just only to configure the Applearian product to match their process, but to really automate and make more transparent to the different levels of stakeholders the types of activities that they need to track inside Applearian. So using this API, and there's two primarily that I'll talk about. One is the Applearian Open Java API here, and the other is the Web Services API. So these are two central elements. Using the Applearian Java API, that is how when I complete the release and click on build, that I directly interrogate the Jenkins server and make a build request of that Jenkins server, or in our case, the Applearian server, and I launch the build within Applearian as well. It is essentially the same toolkit that our developers use to create the product. So the ability that you have, not just in the first, maybe not so much in the first 2 months, but in the 6 months, 12 months, 18 months of evolutionary implementation, as your needs grow, as your need to automate becomes more dominant, then Applearian is an open framework to be able to integrate with this perhaps disparate set of tools, as well as the different data sources that might be coming in. So again, back to the question of integrations, there certainly are key integrations that exist with Jira, with Doors, with Siemens Teamcenter, with RecIF, with HP ALM. There's many tools that have direct integrations. The GitHub integration that I was using earlier is built right into Applearian. But when we need to extend beyond that, the API is important. Now, the Applearian Web Services API is how I, through an external Applearian source, contact and integrate it into Applearian. So the Open Java API is how from Applearian I work within Applearian or reach out to other tools and data sources. But if I wanted, for example, to have a commit hook in my GitHub repository or my Subversion repository or my Perforce repository, and based on a particular commit to a branch, I wanted to in turn have corresponding Applearian actions take place. That's something that can be easily done with the Web Services API. Okay, good question. All right, then so I'll then finally wrap by saying that we've essentially split this into two. The next presentation of DevOps will go into a much more detailed breakdown of the build and deployment structure and how we transfer from ALM into build and deploy operations. I noticed when I looked at the attendee list that some of the attendees were fairly new to Applearian as a tool, and so I wanted to make sure that we focused on some of the aspects of the core ALM that can be brought to all those DevOps scenarios. Again, thank you very much for participating, and I look forward to hearing from you at some point in the future. Thank you.